The colonial-style house in suburban Westchester, New York, stood like a silent sentinel against the howling November blizzard. Inside, the relentless wind rattled the window panes of the isolated attic studio, but Clara Evans barely noticed the chill. She was completely hunched over her digital drawing tablet, her vision blurring as her fingers raced across the stylus. She had to finish the final illustrations for her children's digital educational series tonight. Every deadline felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, yet it was the only piece of her former self she had left. Underneath the desk, Clara's legs were severely swollen, the purple veins on her calves bulging like tangled vines beneath her skin. At 34 weeks pregnant with triplets, even the simple act of drawing a deep breath felt like pulling a rusted bellows. She tried to shift her weight, but her feet were too engorged to fit into even her largest, most comfortable house slippers. A dull, ominous ache throbbed in her lower abdomen, but she bit her lip, forcing herself to focus on the vibrant, happy colors of the digital screen, a stark contrast to the monochrome coldness enveloping her life. Suddenly, the silence of the studio was broken by the sharp vibration of her phone. A priority notification lit up the screen. It was an iMessage from her husband, Julian Vance, the rapidly rising CEO of a prominent EdTech empire. Clara reached for the phone with trembling fingers, hoping for a sliver of warmth, a single question about how she was managing the high-risk pregnancy metrics that had alarmed her doctor just that morning. Instead, the message read with the familiar, clinical coldness of a corporate memo. The Education Summit in London is running late. Still have a few venture capitalists to meet. The flight was delayed for 2 days. Has the nanny sorted everything out? I transferred $50,000 to your card. Tell Maria to buy whatever you need. If the house is short on anything, let Marcus know. Clara stared at the automated bank notification that followed the text. $50,000. It was always money. Over the last 7 years, as Julian's company grew from a chaotic dream into a multi-million-dollar reality, his physical and emotional presence had been systematically replaced by digital wire transfers. She opened the keyboard, her thumbs hovering over the keys. She wanted to type out the truth. The doctor said my cervix has shortened. I am at high risk for a sudden hemorrhage. I am scared, Julian. She waited for 2 agonizing seconds, staring at the flashing cursor. Then, with a hollow sigh, she deleted the sentence letter by letter. She typed a single compliant word. Okay. She set the phone face down, swallowing the bitter taste of stomach acid that constantly surged up her throat. She had become an invisible ghost in her own home, an unpaid labor whose sacrifice was compensated with sporadic charity. Minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a push notification from Instagram. Vivian Sterling, Julian's elite design partner, the woman who had recently been charging to the front lines of the European expansion alongside him, had just updated her story. There was no caption, just a high-definition photograph that shattered Clara's fragile world into 1,000 pieces. The image featured an exquisite slice of French red velvet cake with a glowing 28-foot candle on top, set against the glittering backdrop of a luxury London penthouse. But it was the foreground that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. A man's elegant wrist was using a silver knife to cut the cake. On that wrist was a shallow, distinct burn scar, and he was wearing the Patek Philippe watch that Clara had saved up her freelance earnings for half a year to buy for him. It was Julian's hand. Clara's gaze locked onto the shallow scar. 7 years ago, when they were struggling entrepreneurs living in a freezing basement apartment, she had burned herself on a faulty electric stove while cooking a cheap pot of soup to keep him warm while he drafted his first business plan. She had worn that scar as a badge of honor, a symbol of the foundation they built together. Now, that same scarred hand was celebrating in the warmth of another woman's apartment, wearing the watch she bought him. while she sat alone in a freezing attic. The realization hit her not as a thought, but as a violent physical trauma. The emotional shock rippled through her body, and instantly, a sharp, agonizing pain radiated from her lower abdomen. It felt as if a rusted saw blade was dragging violently across her spine. Clara gasped, dropping her stylus as a sudden rush of warm liquid instantly soaked through her sweatpants. She abruptly doubled over, her upper body slamming against the edge of the desk. Her hand blindly flapped out, knocking her glass of water off the table. The glass shattered on the hardwood floor, the water spreading fast, mimicking the panic taking over her body. "No, no, please, not yet," she gasped, her voice breaking in the dark room. She bit her lower lip so hard she tasted the metallic tang of blood, fighting off a wave of black dizziness. Crawling on her hands and knees through the dark, fighting the severe contractions that were ripping her body apart, she fumbled for the wall intercom. With the last ounce of her strength, she pressed the button, her voice escaping through gritted teeth into the empty house. "Maria, call an ambulance. Now." The frantic, metallic clattering of a surgical gurney rolling across the slick, bleached tiles of Manhattan General Hospital tore through the muted, low-frequency hum of the blizzard howling outside. Fluorescent light fixtures overhead flashed past in a dizzying, rhythmic blur of blinding white and sterile gray, searing painfully into Clara's heavy, half-closed eyelids. Each passing second felt like a violent, agonizing tug-of-war against a cold, creeping abyss that threatened to swallow her whole. The sharp, overwhelming stench of antiseptic, rubbing alcohol, and iron hung thick in the air, invading her lungs with every shallow, desperate gasp she took. Her damp, sweat-drenched strands of hair clung like cold, wet silk to her pale cheeks, and her fingernails dug so deeply into the freezing steel rails of the gurney that they bent backward, her knuckles aching under the immense strain. 34 weeks pregnant with triplets, premature rupture of membranes accompanied by severe, continuous uterine contractions, and massive, uncontrolled hemorrhage. The charge nurse's voice barked out, sharp, rapid, and strained with adrenaline, fighting against the ticking clock. The chief surgeon, his face turning an ashen gray as he reviewed the chart on the move, adjusted his scrub cap and stepped alongside the accelerating gurney. The harsh squeal of the rubber wheels echoed off the concrete walls. "The situation is critical," the surgeon murmured, his voice tight and urgent as they rounded a sharp corner. "It's complicated by a complete, unyielding placenta previa. She is losing blood at an alarming rate. Her blood pressure is cratering into a dangerous valley, and her heart rate is spiking to compensate. We need to perform an emergency cesarean section right this second. Where on earth is the husband? We need the immediate family to sign the surgical consent form now." Clara gasped for air, the oxygen mask over her face fogging up rapidly with her hot, jagged breaths. A muffled scream of absolute, unadulterated agony escaped the back of her throat as another crushing wave of contractions ripped her lower abdomen in two, mimicking the sensation of a burning blade twisting inside her flesh. She swallowed a mouthful of metallic-tasting saliva, her voice hanging by a thread, thready and weak. "My husband is overseas. I will sign the authorization myself. Please just save my babies." A high-risk triplet delivery with this level of internal bleeding? The doctor frowned heavily, his heavy rubber boots clicking sharply on the floor as they reached the double doors of operating room 1. The air here was noticeably colder, biting at Clara's exposed skin. "If you lose consciousness on the operating table, which is highly probable given your current hemoglobin levels, and we have to make an emergency clinical call, such as performing a sudden, life-saving hysterectomy, who makes that decision? We cannot legally accept a self-signature for a procedure that leaves you incapacitated. We need a designated proxy immediately. Call him again." Out in the waiting hallway, Maria stood with trembling hands, her phone pressed so hard against her ear that her skin turned white. She stomped her winter boots in a blind, helpless panic, watching the melting snow drip onto the linoleum floor. She dialed Julian's number for the 18th time. Across the digital waves, the long mechanical ringing tone chimed endlessly, a cold, repetitive mocking sound that eventually disconnected into a pre-recorded, robotic voicemail greeting. Julian's phone was completely off, completely unreachable. At that exact microsecond, thousands of miles away across the dark Atlantic Ocean, the atmosphere could not have been more different. Inside an exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant in Mayfair, London, the air was warm, perfumed with the rich scents of black truffles, aged oak, and expensive red wine. The ambient, melodious drawl of a live cello drowned out the noise of the outside world. Julian Vance stood at the head of a long, pristine white linen table, raising a crystal glass of vintage champagne. The golden bubbles caught the soft, amber glow of the chandelier above. He smiled warmly down at Vivian Sterling, who sat beside him in a couture crimson dress, her eyes sparkling as she prepared to blow out the single candle on an elegant slice of French red velvet cake. Julian was completely insulated, completely detached from the life and death struggle occurring in the frozen heart of Manhattan. To him, his world was a series of successful metrics, and tonight was about celebrating another conquest. Back in the emergency wing, just as the surgical nurses prepared to will Clara past the sterile red line where visitors were strictly forbidden, the heavy, frosted glass entrance doors burst open with a loud, violent thud, bringing in a sudden, icy gust of freezing wind and swirling white snow. A tall, imposing figure stepped into the light. It was Evelyn Vance. Her elegant, tailored cashmere winter coat was flecked with rapidly melting ice, and her aristocratic face was pale with a terrifying mix of fear and rage. The moment Maria had called her house hours ago, breaking through her privacy filters with news of Clara's sudden collapse, Evelyn had not hesitated. She had demanded her private driver navigate the treacherous, unplowed, whiteout streets of New York City, fighting through the blizzard to reach her daughter-in-law. Seeing Clara twisted in absolute agony on the gurney, her sweatpants visibly soaked in dark, ominous blood, Evelyn rushed forward, her leather boots clicking fiercely against the floor. She bypassed the security guards with a single, commanding wave of her hand. She grabbed Clara's freezing, trembling fingers, squeezing them tightly, and burst into tears, not out of weakness, but from a profound, overwhelming mixture of shared maternal agony and fierce maternal protectiveness. "I am here, Clara. Mom is here." Evelyn wept, her voice cracking as she leaned over the rail to kiss Clara's damp, ice-cold forehead. The scent of Evelyn's familiar, comforting lavender perfume cut through the suffocating smell of bleach, giving Clara a fleeting anchor to reality. Evelyn turned her fierce, aristocratic gaze toward the chief surgeon, her tears hardening into ice. "My son is a fool who isn't here, but I am his mother, and I am this woman's family. Tell me exactly what you need to save her." The surgeon, recognizing the fierce authority in the older woman's voice, immediately slapped a stack of emergency authorization papers onto a clipboard, the metal clip snapping with a sharp crack. "Madam, if the patient becomes incapacitated under general anesthesia, we need a legal proxy to authorize drastic measures. The law requires a primary family member's explicit consent for high-risk maternal interventions." Clara looked up through her blurred, tear-filled vision, staring into Evelyn's protective, bloodshot eyes. In the reflection of her mother-in-law's face, Clara saw the absolute, undeniable failure of her 7-year marriage. Julian had abandoned her in a freezing basement of emotional neglect long before this actual blizzard had trapped her. He had substituted love with wire transfers and presence with promises. A strange, unnatural, glacial calmness suddenly washed over Clara's mind, cooling the burning, chaotic terror that had been rushing through her veins. Her survival instinct, fueled by the 3 tiny, fragile lives kicking weakly against her ribs, crystallized into a hard, unshakable diamond of absolute resolve. She would no longer let her life, her body, or the lives of her children be dictated by a man who treated her very existence as a line item on a corporate balance sheet. "Doctor," Clara rasped, her voice suddenly finding a terrifyingly steady, metallic center amidst the chaotic noise of the hallway. She pulled her hand from Evelyn's just long enough to point at the paperwork. "I am exercising my legal right of patient autonomy. I refuse to grant Julian Vance any authority over my medical care. None whatsoever." The nurses froze mid-motion. The chief surgeon blinked in utter surprise, the pen hovering in the air. "Bring me the paperwork for an emergency healthcare proxy," Clara commanded, her grip retightening on Evelyn's hand with surprising, desperate strength. "Right now. Do not make me repeat myself." The admissions clerk quickly pulled a specialized legal form from the folder. With a black ballpoint pen clutched tightly in her shaking, bruised fingers, Clara swiftly filled out the emergency document. She crossed out Julian's pre-printed name under the next of kin section with jagged, violent, definitive strokes that nearly tore the paper apart. In the blank space for the designated primary medical decision-maker, she firmly and clearly printed Evelyn Vance. She pressed the pen down onto the signature line, the force bleeding the dark ink heavily through to the back of the medical paper, an indelible mark of her independence. "It is done," Clara whispered, her body going limp as another wave of exhaustion crashed over her. She looked at Evelyn. "Mom, if it comes down to it, save them." "I will save all of you," Evelyn fiercely promised, her voice echoing down the hall as the heavy double doors of the operating room finally swung shut, locking Evelyn and the rest of the world out. Hours later, far across the ocean, the corporate M&A afterparty in London finally wound down to a quiet whisper. The heavy scent of expensive cigars and rain hung over the Mayfair streets as Julian Vance stepped out of the luxury penthouse building. He loosened his silk tie, breathing in the cool British air, feeling the supreme satisfaction of a man who had just secured millions in European expansion funding. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, powered it back on, and watched as a cascade of data flooded his screen. He noticed the string of 18 missed calls from Maria and a high-priority alert from the Manhattan General Automated System. Frowning slightly, assuming his usual tone of cold, entitled corporate authority, he bypassed his assistant Marcus and dialed the hospital's private VIP hotline directly. When the call connected to the secure nurses' station at Manhattan General, Julian didn't bother introducing himself with humility. "This is Julian Vance. I am calling to check on the status of my wife, Clara Evans. I believe my office sent over a standard electronic signature for her delivery paperwork earlier. Let me speak to the chief surgeon." The charge nurse on duty, a veteran of the ward who had personally filed Clara's newly executed legal restrictions into the electronic system just an hour prior, adjusted her headset. Her response was a voice as cold, flat, and unyielding as the New York blizzard outside. "Mr. Vance, we cannot disclose any clinical information regarding the patient or the newborn infants to you." Julian's brow furrowed sharply, a sudden spike of irritation breaking through his administrative, calculating facade. He leaned against the stone pillar of the London building, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the oppressive weight of a CEO used to total compliance. "What do you mean, you cannot disclose it? I am her husband. I pay the premium private insurance for that entire VIP wing. I demand to know the status of the delivery." As of 2 hours ago, while fully conscious and competent, the patient legally executed an emergency healthcare proxy. The nurse replied textually, her tone deadpan and completely unimpressed by his status. "She has stripped you of all medical decision-making rights and legally restricted your access to her medical records. Your mother, Evelyn Vance, has been designated as the sole legal representative and proxy. No information will be released to you without her written consent. Good night, sir." The line clicked sharply, followed by the hollow, mechanical drone of a dead dial tone. Julian stood completely frozen on the damp London pavement, the phone still pressed tightly against his ear as the wind whipped around his tailored suit. For the first time in his life, his money, his influence, and his corporate power could not buy him access. Back in operating room 1, beneath the blinding, shadowless white surgical lamps, the final chain binding Clara to the title of Mrs. Vance had not just broken, it had been systematically dismantled by her own hand. Clara lay on the freezing, sterile operating table, her arms secured to her sides to prevent involuntary movement. The anesthesia team worked frantically around her head, the sharp, sweet smell of gas filling her mask, while the surgical team worked behind a blue sterile drape. Even though the heavy local blockade isolated her from the sharp, cutting pain of the scalpel, she could feel the terrifying, deep pressure of the doctors working to save her life. The heart monitor beside her emitted rapid, urgent, high-pitched beeps that filled the room with a sense of impending doom. Her blood pressure is still dropping. Systolic is down to 60. Prepare another unit of O-negative blood immediately, the anesthesiologist shouted, his gloved hand tapping the glass of the monitor. Clara felt an intense, heavy chill seeping out bit by bit from the very center of her bones. A dizzying, empty sensation washed over her brain as her life force literally drained onto the table. The blinding white lights overhead began to flicker and dim in her perception, turning into small, distant pinpricks of starlight. She felt herself sliding backward into a warm, dark, and silent abyss where there was no pain, no cold, and no loneliness. "Clara, stay with us. Do not close your eyes," the surgeon's voice echoed, sounding distant, as if he were shouting through a thick curtain of rushing water. "Think of your babies, Clara. They need you to fight." "My babies," her mind whispered into the darkness. The thought acted like a sudden, violent jolt of electricity to her dying heart. If she slipped away now, if she let the darkness take her, who would protect them? Julian would throw money at the problem, leaving them to be raised by highly paid, indifferent nannies, or worse, he would bring them in the superficial world of Vivian Sterling. No, she could not die. She refused to let her life end as a tragic footnote in Julian's success story. With a final, monumental surge of maternal will, Clara pulled herself back from the edge of the void. She forced her lungs to expand, her heart to beat against the heavy pressure in her chest. She could hear the rapid beeping of the monitor begin to stabilize, shifting from a chaotic frenzy back into a steady, defiant rhythm. She was still alive. She was broken, bleeding, and stripped of everything she had once known, but as she drifted into a deep, stable sleep, she knew she had won the first battle. She was no longer Julian's invisible wife. She was a mother, and she was finally free. Waking up in the sterile, hyper-monitored quiet of the intensive care unit, Clara did not cry. The rhythmic, artificial beep of the heart monitor filled the cold space, counting the seconds of her survival. Her throat felt as though she had swallowed hot sand, and the burning agony of a fresh 6-inch vertical incision across her lower abdomen throbbed relentlessly with every shallow breath. She had lost 2,500 milliliters of blood. The on-duty nurse had quietly whispered that it was an absolute miracle the surgical team had managed to save her uterus. Her triplets, 3 fragile, tiny miracles, were stable but wired to breathing tubes in the nearby neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. 2 days later, once she was moved to a regular private room, The space was quickly filled with expensive floral arrangements of white lilies and luxury wellness hampers, all ordered by Julian's office. Her phone buzzed, displaying a new notification. Julian had wired $2 million to her account, accompanied by a text, "Hear you had a rough time. Rest well. I've hired a specialist to pick the babies' names. I'll fly in tomorrow. Tell Marcus to buy you whatever you want." In the past, Clara would have called him weeping, seeking validation, only to swallow her resentment when he explained how exhausted he was from feeding thousands of employees. But looking at the screen, now, the old pattern shattered. A profound mindset shift locked into place. The illusion of the helpless victim dissolved under the harsh hospital lights. She realized that crying over his neglect would never heal her. She had to stop waiting for a rescue that was never coming and take absolute responsibility for her own life and her children's future. She treated the $2 million notification like a piece of spam. She turned the phone face down, her eyes terrifyingly calm. Her deliberate transformation began not with tears, but with cold, strategic actions. Her first concrete step was reclaiming her financial and intellectual sovereignty. Clara immediately called her brilliant, sharp-witted attorney and lifelong friend, Victoria Kensington. When Victoria arrived, shocked to see Clara sitting upright despite her severe postpartum frailty, Clara didn't ask for a standard messy divorce. Instead, she reached into her canvas bag and handed over a black USB drive. 7 years ago, while working in that freezing, drafty basement apartment, Clara had possessed the foresight to protect her creative labor. She had registered the entire underlying logic, interactive framework, and graphic architecture of the core curriculum system under her own independent holding company. Crucially, the licensing agreement she signed back then contained a specific addendum. The royalty-free authorization was valid exclusively during the legal marriage of both parties. The moment divorce proceedings commenced, the lease automatically terminated. "I am officially serving Julian's company a notice of non-renewal on their month-to-month IP lease," Clara instructed, her voice steady and sharp. "And I have already finalized negotiations with Apex Early Learning, Julian's fiercest competitor. They are buying the exclusive rights to my Starlight Interactive module for $3 million in cash, effective immediately." Victoria stared at the documents, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "This completely cuts the legs out from under his empire. Clara, he won't know what hit him." But Clara's action steps didn't stop with corporate warfare. She knew she needed to rebuild her physical and mental foundation to sustain this new life. Despite the sharp pain pulling at her stitches, she began intensive postpartum physical therapy right there in the room, forcing her swollen feet to walk the length of the floor. She cut out the heavy, guilt-ridden diet of her past, replacing it with strict nutritional guidelines to reclaim her strength. She began studying advanced digital product management and financial analytics on her tablet, trading the oversized, hiding-in-the-shadows hoodies of her invisible wife days for a sharp, tailored, minimalist wardrobe that Victoria brought to the hospital. The final stone in her new foundation was building a real village of honor and emotional safety. Julian's top operations manager, Marcus, walked into the room later that afternoon to deliver a corporate message. However, seeing Clara's gaunt but fierce determination, and knowing the disgusting truth of Julian's behavior in London, Marcus faced his own breaking point. "I can't do this anymore, Clara," Marcus said, his voice trembling as he placed his corporate ID badge on her bedside table. "I've followed Julian for years, but what he did to you is unforgivable. I submitted my resignation this morning." "Then come with me," Clara replied smoothly. "My new venture needs a brilliant director of operations." The ultimate validation of Clara's transformation arrived when the door opened once more, revealing Evelyn Vance. Julian's mother looked at the packed canvas bags, the signed voluntary discharge papers, and the resolute fire in her daughter-in-law's eyes. I am leaving him, Evelyn, Clara said openly, completely prepared for her mother-in-law to defend her only son. Instead, Evelyn walked over, gently wrapping her arms around Clara's frail shoulders. No, my dear, Evelyn whispered fiercely, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. We are leaving him. He has built a house of cards on your blood and tears, and he deserves to watch it fall. I bought a beautiful, standalone estate facing the ocean in Monterey Bay, California. The neonatal transport vehicles are already downstairs waiting for my grandchildren. We are going home. An hour later, Clara walked out of the hospital under her own power, refusing the wheelchair, flanked by Evelyn and Marcus. As the medical transport vehicles roared to life, heading away from the suffocating snow of New York toward the bright promise of the California coast, Clara looked out the window. She had completely stripped Julian of his power over her health, her assets, and her mind. The invisible wife had stepped out of the shadows, and for the first time in 7 years, she was the author of her own destiny. Back in New York, the predatory empire that Julian Vance had built on 7 years of silent sacrifice began to violently unravel. He had returned from London expecting a tearful, submissive wife whom he could easily pacify with luxury jewelry and large wire transfers. Instead, he walked into a boardroom that had transformed into a corporate war zone. The first heavy blow struck on a Monday morning during a high-stakes meeting with his executive team. The frosted glass doors of the boardroom were abruptly thrown open, and the chief legal officer rushed in, his face pale and dripping with cold sweat. Ignoring the gasps of the senior executives, he dropped a legally stamped federal document directly onto the black walnut conference table. It was an official copyright injunction and a notice of immediate asset freeze. Mr. Vance, we have a catastrophic problem, the lawyer stammered. Your wife's legal team has officially terminated our IP lease because the core curriculum's architecture and interactive logic were registered under her independent holding company. She has legally pulled the license. Worse, she has signed an exclusive rights agreement with Apex Early Learning. Julian's eyes widened in disbelief, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his fountain pen. That's impossible. She was a stay-at-home wife. That curriculum is a work for hire. It isn't, the lawyer whispered, pulling up the original 2017 incorporation filings on his tablet. She registered the copyrights 3 months before this corporation even existed. The lease was on a month-to-month basis, valid only during the marriage. As of 10 a.m., our online platforms are in gross violation of federal copyright law. Apex has already filed a massive intellectual property infringement lawsuit against us. We are legally mandated to take down every single online course and franchise portal immediately. Before Julian could even process the destruction of his product line, the corporate guillotine fell a second time. Clara's attorney, Victoria Kensington, had delivered a meticulously detailed forensic auditing dossier directly to the company's board of directors and the SEC, U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. For the past 6 months, Julian had arrogantly assumed his financial tracks were covered. But Clara, utilizing her sharp analytical skills, had tracked every single classified cash flow. The dossier contained bulletproof evidence proving that Julian had systematically diverted $450,000 from corporate reserve funds under the guise of consulting fees to protect and guarantee a highly competitive municipal land plot in the Southside Tech Park for Vivian Sterling's private fashion factory. The reaction from the financial sector was swift and merciless. The corporate veil was instantly pierced. The venture capitalists from London, horrified by the looming scandal of corporate embezzlement and fraud, immediately pulled their entire funding package. The board of directors voted unanimously to suspend Julian from his CEO duties, freezing his corporate shares and blocking his access to all Tier 1 bank accounts for an emergency forensic investigation. Julian's absolute authority was crushed in a matter of hours, leaving him trapped in a crumbling tower of his own making. Meanwhile, the absolute karma that the public had fiercely craved caught up with Vivian Sterling in the most brutal manner. Vivian had falsely believed she was entirely insulated from Julian's impending ruin. She thought she had outsmarted everyone by manipulating Julian into funneling $20 million of European profits into a highly classified offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, legally standing under her younger brother's name. However, Clara's relentless investigation had unearthed a delicious, fatal flaw in Vivian's grand design. Vivian's brother was a reckless, high-stakes gambler who had been heavily targeted and set up by ruthless loan sharks in Las Vegas. He had accumulated massive, unpayable underground debts. Weeks before Julian's corporate collapse, the Las Vegas syndicates had legally and illegally triggered the global cross-collateral guarantees he had signed. The entire $20 million trust in the Cayman Islands had already been completely liquidated and seized to clear his gambling debts. The safety net Vivian had paged out her soul to build was completely gone. She was holding nothing but empty air. The final hammer of justice fell at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Dressed in a luxury trench coat and carrying a designer suitcase, Vivian tried to board a one-way flight to Zurich to escape the impending fallout. As she approached the gate, 4 federal agents stepped out of the shadows, flashing their badges. "Vivian Sterling, you are under arrest for federal corporate embezzlement, conspiracy to defraud investors, and grand-scale money laundering," the leading agent announced coldly. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her delicate wrists, shattering her pristine, arrogant facade. Escorted through the crowded terminal in front of flashing cameras, Vivian completely broke down in a fit of hysterical terror. Realizing she was facing decades in a federal penitentiary and that her wealth had evaporated into thin air, her absolute selfishness took over. The moment she was brought to the interrogation room, she greedily signed a full confession, flipping entirely on Julian and turning over every piece of incriminating state's evidence to secure a plea deal for herself. Julian's downfall was now absolute. The woman he had treated as a parasite had detached herself, leaving him to be devoured by the real parasites he had invited into his life. His empire was dead, his reputation was ruined, and the machinery of justice was closing in, driven entirely by the brilliant, silent calculations of the wife he had chosen to ignore. A breathtaking, amber glow washed over the Pacific Ocean as the sun began its slow descent along the coastline of Monterey Bay, California. The cool, refreshing sea breeze carried the crisp scent of salt water, a stark contrast to the suffocating, stale air of the New York corporate rooms Clara had left behind. 1 year had passed since her rebirth. In that time, Clara's new venture, Starlight Education, had completely revolutionized the EdTech market. By focusing on ethical, human-centric design and intuitive digital frameworks, the very principles she had championed in obscurity for years, she had built an empire that now commanded 60% of the premium market. Inside the grand auditorium of the Monterey Bay Convention Center, the annual Global Innovation Summit was drawing to a close. The lights in the hall dimmed, and a single spotlight focused on the center of the stage. Clara stepped forward to deliver the keynote address. She wore a pristine, tailored, minimalist white suit, a striking visual symbol of her absolute self-actualization and supreme confidence. Her posture was perfectly straight, the long vertical scar beneath her clothes no longer a reminder of trauma, but a badge of absolute survival. When we treat every response as a given and every companion as something to be compensated with material goods, we lose our right to educate. Clara's voice resonated through the auditorium, steady, powerful, and deeply moving. The same rule applies to our businesses and to our lives. The room erupted into thunderous, standing applause. As the house lights came up, Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant smile, a relaxed expression of pure joy that had been entirely absent from her face during her 7 years of marriage. She did not mention Julian's name once. She had risen to a height so grand that the rotten ruins of her past were completely crushed beneath her feet. Following the presentation, Clara walked down the private VIP hallway, flanked by her new director of operations, Marcus, who was reviewing the first quarter revenue share documents on his tablet. Suddenly, a gaunt, disheveled figure stepped out from the shadows of the corridor, intercepting their path. It was Julian. His bespoke suit, once the armor of his entitled arrogance, now hung loosely on his visibly diminished frame. His hair had turned a premature gray, and his eyes were heavily bloodshot, carrying the hollow look of a man who had just signed his own bankruptcy liquidation order the day before. Marcus instantly stepped forward to block him, but Clara gently raised her hand, signaling her team to wait. She looked at Julian, her expression completely tranquil. There was no trace of lingering hatred in her eyes, no vindictive triumph, and no anger. It was the absolute, chilling blankness one reserves for a complete stranger. "Clara, please," Julian whispered, his voice cracking as his hands shook violently. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp, legally bound folder, holding it out to her like a beggar pleading for salvation. "This is everything I have left. I bought back the remaining offshore copyrights, and I cleared a clean, debt-free trust account. No liabilities. The sole beneficiaries are the triplets. I know it's useless compared to what I threw away, but please take it. Let it be my compensation to you and the kids." Clara didn't even reach out to touch the folder. She merely looked down at the paper, her lips curling into a soft, pitying sigh. "Are you still playing this self-touching charade, Julian?" Clara asked, her tone lighter than the ocean mist, but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "You truly never learned how to look beyond your own reflection, did you?" Julian blinked, his breath hitching. "The copyrights you claim to have bought back were legally voided for material breach of contract 3 weeks ago when Apex collapsed your old firm," Clara explained calmly, lacing her hands together. "And that clean offshore trust? Vivian's brother didn't just lose the Cayman funds. He signed unlimited personal guarantees to Las Vegas loan sharks. Federal executors officially seized and liquidated the underlying assets of that entire trust yesterday afternoon to satisfy the state's criminal forfeiture." Julian's breath stopped entirely. His face turned an ashen white as the folder slipped from his trembling fingers, the papers fluttering uselessly onto the cold marble floor. His final card, his grand gesture of transactional redemption, was nothing but worthless junk that she had already seen through days ago. "You have absolutely nothing left, Julian." Clara delivered the final, definitive sentence of their shared history. "You have nothing left to give me, and you no longer possess the legal or moral standing to offer closure to my children. We owe each other nothing." Turning her back to him, she looked at Marcus. "Please tell security to be more careful with the guest list. We have a private celebration to attend." She walked away, the steady, rhythmic click of her high heels echoing down the hallway. She did not look back, not even once. Behind her, Julian's knees completely gave out. He slid heavily down the marble wall, burying his gaunt face in his hands as his shoulders shook with violent, silent sobs, trapped forever in the prison of his own regret. Clara stepped through the heavy glass exit doors and into the brilliant, warm light of the California golden hour. The sky was a magnificent canvas of deep gold, amber, and soft pinks. A few yards away on the white sand of the beach, a white SUV sat idling. Baba Evelyn was standing by the open door, waving warmly, her face etched with a peaceful joy. Next to her, Marcus was laughing as he helped the triplets, now healthy, beautiful toddlers, take their first brave, steady steps on the sand. The children looked up, spotting her, and began calling out her name with pure, unadulterated delight. Clara felt a profound wave of healing wash over her spirit, cleansing the very last of the old New York winter from her bones. A brilliant, unburdened smile spread across her face. She ran her hand over her minimalist white jacket, stepped onto the sand, and walked forward into the golden light to embrace her true family, completely free, beautifully whole, and fiercely proud. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.